Let's get close, but not so close. Quarantine. You can share from a distance. Quarantine. You know we want to see each other. We'll have to stay in your quarantine space while we talk.
Hello, welcome to the 24th episode of Quarantime. I realized today that it is exactly 12 weeks from when I was on my last airplane and came home, and we've settled in for this period of both hunkering down, reckoning, and change. And we went on the air with this about 11 weeks ago. From the start, we talked about the fact that this would be an extraordinary period that would bring about change. And of course, initially we were talking about what would be happening to the economy, to downtowns, to how we worked, to communications. And we also said that, we had this notion, I think many of the conversations early on in the show, where it would be a shame to lose this as an opportunity to bring about significant change. Probably we didn't realize that the thing that would catalyze very quick change in how America thinks about a problem and looks at things was the George Floyd and this particular police violence that was so horrendous, got so much attention, and catalyzed interest not only all over the U.S. but around the world. And so we find ourselves in a moment that, particularly a week ago, was incredibly disruptive and frightening, and now is increasingly hopeful as there's a consensus or certainly a moving towards a realization of reimagining how we go about fundamental things, how we accomplish policing. I think there's been much more of a sensitivity among the privileged of what privilege is, where before people are oblivious to it. So that's kind of fascinating. That's kind of what we want to get into today. You may remember in our last show, we spent a bunch of time with Cordell Carter of the Aspen Institute getting into kind of the history about how America looked at her freedoms and kind of marching from James Madison up through Dr. King. We were going to have on the last show Sylvester Monroe, but there was a technical difficulty. So Sylvester, who was with Time magazine during the Rodney King whole set of incidents, where media and the story of how a story is covered was huge. Rodney is with us again today. We also going to have Jeff Cowan today, who played a key role as a freedom writer and publisher early on in civil rights world of the 1960s. And we're bringing back, for the second time, Dr. Sophia Noble, who we ran a rerun of last time, but her book, Algorithms of Oppression, really helped frame all of this. So this is an important show because today we're really going to focus on covering activism and decoding spin. This is really how the act of covering the story affects the story itself, and also, particularly in this modern era, there's so many different ways things can be spun technologically and algorithmically, just as we saw with COVID. Joining me, Mickey is back. Hello, Mickey. Hi. Let's make sure everybody's mic is on. Say hello.
Hi, how you doing, Peter?
Okay,
excellent. I'm here. I'm happy to be here.
Good. So welcome back. You were away last time. This topic of how stories are told and how they're manipulated is a fascinating one, particularly when we look at civil rights, because you can really tell the modern history of this through media. The world of television and the world of activism grew up together in the 50s and 60s. The world of user-generated content and videos was crucial to the story from 1991 until now, and here we are with social media. So that's kind of what we're going to tee up today. I'm giving you an opening to say something.
Yeah.
Can you, or not? You don't have to say something. We could go right to our first guest. Okay, well, either Mickey can hear me or not. Well, let's bring Sylvester Monroe on. Sylvester, welcome.
Thanks, Peter.
Hi. You and I are both senior fellows at the USC Annenberg Center for Communications Leadership and Policy. And you've had a distinguished career as a journalist at the Washington Post and at Time. And you have been covering the civil rights story, key parts of it throughout history. So maybe tell us a little bit about yourself and then how you found yourself in the middle of the whole Rodney King story and the time frame of that, because it really took a couple of years to play out. We forget that today.
Yeah. So most recently, I was at the Washington Post, and before that, actually at San Jose Mercury News, Newsweek, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. I have and been posted all over the country. So I've actually covered such events across America. In 1992, I was a correspondent in the Los Angeles bureau of Time magazine. And when the Rodney King video, it's interesting that that video was shot by a man named George Halliday from his balcony with in 1992, we didn't have the kinds of cell phones we have today where everybody's taking these kinds of videos. But that video caused a firestorm across the world. I mean, everybody saw it. Everybody assumed, there was this group of police officers beating the crap out of this black motorist named Rodney King. And everybody assumed that these cops were going to go to jail. They were indicted. 4 of them were indicted. And then a year later, the beating occurred in 1991. Almost a year later, in March, April, 1992, the verdicts came down. I was sitting in the bureau in Westwood, Los Angeles, with my colleagues. I was the only black correspondent on the staff on the West Coast, and these verdicts came down, and everyone was just in shock. They assumed we had the video, we saw it, we saw what happened, and the police officers were acquitted. It had I was outraged, just like Black Americans and Black people everywhere and others. But it also had a particular sort of impact on me as a reporter, because I was the only person at first, for the first 24 hours or so, for Time magazine, who actually went out in the field to cover, because unlike today's demonstrations, protests, people were actually being attacked. And as you know, more than 50 people were killed over 4 days of rioting in Los Angeles. So, and it wasn't safe for white people to be out in South Los Angeles at that time. One of the most egregious hotspots at that time was at the corner of that infamous corner now that people know, if they don't know it personally, if they've heard of it, the corner of Florence and Normandy in South Central, where a white truck driver named Reginald Denny was attacked and pulled out of the cab of his truck and beaten with a cinder block nearly half to death. And there were spontaneous flashpoints like that all over the city.
Because today's cycle times are so amazing, right? Today, the Floyd video happened, posted, and then people unfortunately almost know the routine. People start protesting a couple days later, people aren't arrested, and these things took place very quickly. But in the case of Rodney King, it was almost a year, right? There was the original event, and people you're right, people assume it happened. And you told me that you were with faith leaders at the time the verdict came down, and you kind of saw how the community kind of form a response or lost control of it.
Right. Well, go back to this a little bit. I had been back and forth to the courthouse in Simi Valley, though I didn't cover the trial every day. I covered the things that sort of went on outside. And I didn't go to the courthouse that day. We all gathered in the bureau around the television to hear the verdicts. And as the bailiff read those not guilty verdicts, there was just this sort of numbing silence in the bureau, everybody. But I had this really sick feeling in the pit of my stomach that this is unbelievable. That every time I heard "not guilty," I heard a real expletive that I can't say here being said. To hell with black people. We don't care about black people. And I just got really angry and outraged. And so I left the bureau. I've told this story before. I left the bureau. My colleagues were also my friends, but I just couldn't look at them. They were all white. And I left the bureau and went to this meeting at a community church, at First AME Church, pastored by Chip Murray, a local activist. And the mayor was there, Tom Bradley at the time. And they were trying to decide what to do if the verdict came back not guilty. While we were in the church, somebody comes in and says, guys, we're too late. The city is already going up in flames. I went outside, and Western Avenue, which is near where the church is, there were buildings already on fire, and people were in the streets and attacking anybody that they saw that was white.
I mean, when we think of a contrast to now, one of the amazing things about this is the response here seems to be much more of an all hands on deck, all ages, all races, evidently lots of countries on board. What's your sense for how
this is much more organized? I mean, there was no Black Lives Matter movement then. This was a spontaneous eruption of pent-up frustration and anger that had been there for many years. People feeling like, we've told you these police are out of control. We've told you this, and you haven't done anything about it. For a little bit of context, the exact same thing had happened in 1965 in the Watts riots. Police had abused a black man, and the police got off, and people just erupted.
Yeah, we alluded to it last time. We have a thing coming up a little bit later today, but in the hearings that were held in '67 after the Detroit riots, the guy giving the expert testimony, John Spiegel, pointed out that in almost every case, the immediate cause was police violence, right? And then people are out churning, and there's a moment in which community leaders could get it handled, and then he talks about the Roman holiday where just it explodes, where you lose time. It's very interesting. We're going to go on in a moment and take a look at some other events in the civil rights era. But as we're talking about people organizing, I'd love to bring on, also because I want to introduce everybody at the top of the show, Dr. Sophia Noble, who was with us before. Dr. Noble, one of the interesting points here is you write a lot about the criticism of the manipulation of social media, but here, this is a case of how technologies of organization may be helping because they're ways of expressing or organizing that are contemporary, that either didn't exist in '91 or people weren't organized. I'm interested just to get from the two of you kind of thoughts on the communications environment then and now.
Well, one thing I want to say is it's just such a pleasure to be on the show with the two of you and Mr. Monroe, just to have followed and respect your work so deeply and the contribution that Black journalists make to helping us understand these moments. Certainly, I can say that I remember seeing that video. I was about 21 years old. I was an undergrad. And I remember being part of the spontaneous response to the verdict. And I know that in many ways it is similar. People erupt to the injustice, whether there's a record of it or not. Now, one of the things that I think is incredibly powerful in this moment is the hyper circulation, certainly, of these images, of videos and photographs of Black people dead or dying. And in the social media environment and the web, what we find is that those images are often about news spectacle. They feed into a 24/7 news media environment. And the unfortunate part of that is that while we have much more visibility, we often find that the justice is not, in fact, rendered on behalf of the victims and their families of police brutality. And so the question, I think, is even if we have the records, will we have the justice? Whether it's in the television environment of the 1990s or it's in the contemporary moment where, the world is seeking justice for George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, so many names. What we've tended to think is that if we had the records, if we had more records and more people saw the records, saw the evidence, saw the video, the photographs, that then there would be justice. But those things don't exactly line up. And so I think this is a really important conversation to have.
Yeah, I mean, it's as if back then it was as if people looked at that video and thought, you can't believe what the defense attorneys for the police were saying is that you can't believe your own lying eyes. That there's more to it. And the more to it actually is that in many of these cases, and it's going to happen in this case, the victim is often vilified by the police to justify what the police did to that individual. Now, it seems almost impossible right now to justify what that police officer did to George Floyd, but we will see.
Absolutely. I mean, we saw this immediately when Mike Brown was murdered in Ferguson, Missouri, that the most popular Google search on Mike Brown's name was his criminal record. We saw that this week in the case of George Floyd, that Google was auto-completing criminal record in association with George Floyd's name. So we know that these are organized efforts, both by people attempting to spread disinformation and discredit victims, or by the company's own kind of willful neglect, because those who might look at that kind of clickbait will help those companies make money. So I think it's, this is where we get into like the political economy, let's say, of Black death and dying. And again, the willful, I think, in many cases, or benign neglect of the whole ecosystem to find justice for the families and the victims. And this is, to me, the broader concern about how platforms and social media and search engines and the like drown out, in fact, the voices of people like you, Mr. Monroe, Black journalists and people who have the sensitivity and the nuance and the detail, quite frankly, to tell these stories.
So what we're up against is an entrenched culture of police behavior, and that is built upon a view that Black people, Black men in particular, are more dangerous, more violent, more devious than other people, and so a lot of people in the community who would sit on juries think, well, if the police had him down, he must have done something wrong. And so maybe we don't have the whole story. And time again, that the other part of this is that police officers, in this sort of skewed view of Black people as being more dangerous and whatnot, police, one of the defenses is always, well, I feared for my life. Now, you tell me how in the world anybody feared for their life with the man on the ground and your knee on his neck, two other police officers standing up watching, and I'm told that in the other part there were other police officers holding him down the middle of his body. And yet, that may be part of this defense.
Well, absolutely. There's no question. We have many scholars who, in fact, are writing important work about the legitimation of the fear of Blackness through the courts. Of course, this is one of the really important reasons why we need critical race theorists, for example, in the field of legal studies, to help us understand how the fear or the allegation of fear can be weaponized to destroy and dehumanize Black people, Black lives. There's no question that this happens. It happens also in the propagation of disinformation and misinformation about Black people. And of course, this is where, I'm particularly concerned with how these systems, these media systems, by 1,000 cuts, dehumanize every minute of the day the voices, the experiences, the realities. And we see this across many fields. We see it in the medical field, for example, where Black doctors do not give sufficient care to Black people because they don't believe us when we say we're in pain, because they don't believe that we're telling the truth. Black people die because they are neglected by the medical establishment. There's a whole host of ways that this desensitization to the value of Black life. And I would argue, in fact, that the whole premise of this country was founded upon the notion that Black people were not human beings. So we are, in fact, not starting from a premise that Black people are human beings in the eyes of the law or in the eyes of this country. We're starting from the premise that we weren't human beings and trying to dig our way into pictures of humanity, quite frankly. And this is one of the reasons to me why it's so easy and so profitable for these companies, these media systems and so forth to engage with us on these terms.
And why it's so stressful to be African American in almost any sense, because at every turn you're struggling to affirm your humanity over and over and over again. We had a perfect example of what you're talking about, Sophia, in just this past week. Amazingly, a woman named Amy Cooper, who was walking her dog in Central Park off a leash, and there's a leash law there, and a Black man who was watching birds in the park asked her to put her dog on a leash. Instead, she makes a hysterical 911 call and says that she's being harassed by a Black man. Luckily, the gentleman videotaped the whole conversation that he had with her. And when the police arrived, they said, "What's going on here?" And she, in her hysteria, said, "This guy is harassing me." And it turned, this time the video helped this Black guy because he hadn't harassed her at all. He had simply asked, but it showed the power of that image of a Black man as being so dangerous and violent.
Well, do either of you derive hope just in this current last couple of weeks when there has been outpourings of support globally, or in the case of the event in Central Park, where the zeitgeist moved very quickly on how egregious that was? Are you deriving hope from the present moment that there's a mentality change, or does this, or maybe not? Maybe it both fits a pattern, and as you say, Dr. Noble, there are plenty of forces of disinformation. I'm wondering how you resolve the present moment.
Well, I wanted to say for sure that we know that the allegation of a threat to white people, white women in particular, is weaponized against Black people. And we have Emmett Till and Christian Cooper that we can point to. Thank God Christian Cooper survived and didn't become another Emmett Till who might be murdered at the false allegation, quite frankly, because we know, in fact, that the woman who accused Emmett Till of inappropriately engaging her, in fact, lied. So do I feel like there might be some potential? Well, certainly one of the things that we see in social media vis-a-vis what we call Black Twitter, or Black people who are on social media, in particular on Twitter, is that justice comes quite swiftly in terms of being named, being shamed, being outed, being held accountable in the court of public opinion in social media, when people like, the woman who called the police on African Americans barbecuing in my old neighborhood in Oakland at Lake Merritt, or the latest Amy Cooper. So we know that, of course, people want to see accountability, and in the past, it was much more difficult to find these bad actors and make them visible. So sure, a culture of accountability in social media. Black people have used these systems to force those conversations into the public's view. And quite frankly, journalists pick up these stories and cover them. And so that's important. Does that bring about justice or shift the culture of white supremacy? I would say not. I would say if we look at the halls of power in this country, from the White House to the Supreme Court to the Senate, we have a regressive kind of moment that we're living in where we are seeing a full-blown rollback of civil rights and of women's rights. So Black Twitter has not effectively been able to help us intervene in the highest halls of power, maybe at the level of kind of street karma. But I think, when we talk about the kinds of egregious public policies that are being implemented, which include, quite frankly, a militarized police state, and the kind of things we watched on the news this week, journalists being shot with rubber bullets, being mowed over, cameramen being struck, and women. I think that signals to us that no matter what we think is happening on social media, on the internet, in real time, power is being exacted, and quite viciously, against the public, and in some of the most anti-democratic ways we can imagine.
It's interesting that this has kindled, there's several conversations. There's this whole conversation about how do you actually put in place accountability in law enforcement, right? And so people are talking about, there's I guess a real awareness of how union contracts can perpetuate things. And it's come out that here in San Francisco, we may not hire policemen who committed acts of violence to people, and people are saying we didn't even know that went on. So there's some sense that perhaps that mechanism can move quickly. But you're right. How do you change juries and the courts? That's obviously a much longer, I guess lead time. And then to say nothing of national leadership right now. Sylvester, you just wrote a piece just finishing a piece which is advice to younger Black journalists. I'm wondering, both advice you guys are giving and for everybody else who's on social media and trying to figure out how to help, what some of your thoughts are. And then, Mick, I'd love to bring you in because you've been taking pretty good notes here. So, Sylvester, you tell me about this piece you wrote today.
What I did was I made some comparisons about today, and less advice and more perspective is that Black journalists on the streets covering these things, and I think we mentioned this at the top of the show, are increasingly important because of the perspective they bring, the context they can add, and making sure that the sensibilities of Black people in these nuanced situations are pushed to the forefront.
I want to, hey, Mick, are you... you and your whiteboard. I wanted to bring you in because I see you furiously making notes, which we should share with the audience. Yeah.
Sure. Omid, do you want to pull up the whiteboard? We try to keep an infinite whiteboard of this. So I've been just trying to capture the conversation with Sylvester and Sophia. And, Sylvester was talking a little bit about that street corner, right? Florence and Normandy, and how the truck driver was pulled out as part of the riots, and the church discussion. But what I really think was powerful in just even this conversation so far was this notion of, yes, we're seeing the hypercirculation for news spectacle, but is it leading to justice? And I think the death of not 1,000 cuts, I'm almost feeling like it's the death of 10 million cuts because algorithms can expand so fast. I worry deeply that all of the records that we have, this notion of having real records of police behavior or violent behavior, you would imagine justice happens. But having all the records, with deepfake, we can actually make Obama say anything he wants. He could be a racist tomorrow with deepfake and an Adobe plugin. We can actually change all the video that's ever been made. So what I'm very nervous about is the casual video tools and the fact that most people that are capturing these on the phone are not capturing them onto their phone. They're capturing them into a cloud that's owned by somebody else. And that cloud can actually just lose things and can change things. So I'm maybe more nervous that as the algorithms and the people that are in charge of them for salacious content as their business model, the Facebooks of the world, are learning right now how to do things from everybody using Facebook and Instagram to organize, that will mean something pretty dramatically bad for our elections in November, because we're teaching the algorithms now how to mitigate actual justice, and what will happen then. So I've only seen a few efforts of people having secure phone that are based on justice capture and based on not being on a platform that actually secures it and copies it to another facility that is not owned by the police or by a giant platform. But I'm worried deeply that we won't have the record when it comes time to actually have the courts. And so that's just personally me, but I'm also trying to capture the conversation, and I'm encouraging anyone who's watching, they can click on the whiteboard and come and join us and add their own comments or do a little archaeology from past episodes and what it means. I don't want to distract the conversation now, though, because I'm really appreciating just listening to Sophia and Sylvester. I've noticed that for my own personal, I'm a tall white guy. I'm so lucky in this world. It's insane, right? I'm blessed 10 times over. And I think in the last conversation we had with Kathy O'Neill and Sophia, she mentioned, she's a mathematician who joined us with Sophia last time. She mentioned that many of the algorithms and the training data that we have in these systems, these platforms, make lucky people luckier. And this notion that Sophia said, we started not as even being considered humans if we had a drop of African blood or a drop of colored blood in our bodies at the birth of this nation. So we're not coming from even fair or lucky. Many people, our families, our friends, and others that don't have the blessings that I have, that I got for free by being born what I am. And so how do we help unlucky people, and in this case, marginalized people and people who have systematic racism and violence against them? How do we help them at least be lucky enough to have a fair shake? Because fairness is what this boils down to. And as a society, I see now protesters are actually calling on the Human Rights Court of other countries, because America is actually a failed state in this regard. We cannot have any authority when we say to dictators, don't do this stuff to your own people, when we're doing it to our own people. So there's a really high tension here, and I feel like the best I can do is listen and support people, because I don't have an answer, and I don't think I should have an answer, but I have some platform that's different than African Americans, and I'm happy to share it and take the lead. I'd rather I'll take the lead.
So after to give you an example, there was a lot of hope after the Los Angeles riots. There was police reform, a new police commission, sort of kind of police review, and all of that. And to be fair, relations between the Los Angeles Police Department and the Black community in Los Angeles are much better. And yet, it has not stopped the kind of behavior that we're talking about today. And why is that? And that is because the real issue, the tough issue, is accountability. My brother is a police officer in Gary, Indiana Police Department. And he tells me that it is almost impossible to get the boys in blue to turn on other boys in blue, even when they know they're wrong. That's what we're up against.
Now, and I want to just, in the interest of full disclosure, I have a niece who is a female police officer in Chicago who actually faced, and I can't talk much about it, but faced incredible structural violence and gender bias because of the blue line, and she yet believes deeply in the beat cop, wandering the neighborhood, getting to know people, looking for ways of doing things, and helping with all the things that we really do need good sort of community policing for. She and many other people in my family are having a very hard time right now understanding even what they're seeing. And by the way, Chicago has an African-American female mayor, Lori Lightfoot, who is trying really hard But to your point, Sylvester, the institutional and by the way, just this idea that any group that feels that they have to defend something, and that in their own mind have been led to believe that they are the last line of defense for X, will have a tribal kind of approach, of course. And so we can't even say that's necessarily negative to want to defend your tribe, but that's too far.
Real community policing does work.
It does,
because you are actually on the street. You actually know people. For most Black people I know, and I certainly have, the concept of officer friendly, I have never met officer friendly. But when you know people, so one of the points that came out back in 1992 was that many police officers on the Los Angeles Police Department did not live in Los Angeles. Many of them lived in Simi Valley, which oddly enough was where the police officers who beat Rodney King were tried, because it was said by their defense attorneys that they could not get a fair trial in Los Angeles. They should have been tried in Los Angeles. But my point is that the police officers who do not live in the communities that they serve are much easier, are much more likely to not sort of view people as human beings or deserving of the kind of respect that they would if they actually knew people.
Yeah. I mean, let's put a finer point on Simi Valley while we're at it. Simi Valley and the Valley broadly was a place in Los Angeles County and Southern California that had racist real estate covenants that were signed by white people to ensure that people of color, especially African Americans, could not buy real estate in those places. So, if we're going to kind of tell the story, we need to really be clear about what we're saying. We're saying that police officers who live and own homes in neighborhoods that systematically, illegally discriminate against African Americans from living in those neighborhoods, meaning that they have very little contact with African Americans except when they come in to brutalize them in Los Angeles and in South Los Angeles, South Central Los Angeles, I think is a really important point that Sylvester's bringing out. And then those people get to go back to, in the case of Rodney King's abusers, to their home community that is already inclined to discriminate. Yeah. So that's the jury pool. So I think this is the part that when we start talking about how systems and structures of racism work, it's in the weeds. Now, one of the reasons why people right now, for example, are calling, and Black Lives Matter, are calling for abolition or defunding of the police is because they're arguing that you have to deal with these structural dimensions like real estate covenants, histories of redlining, histories of economic discrimination, lack of public health and public schooling education. The whole system is really designed to be an extension of the social relations and the social order when Black people, quite frankly, were enslaved. So we don't deal with those dimensions. And this is one of the reasons why I think many people right now are arguing that police reform will not work, because it doesn't deal with these structural dimensions of how officers are rewarded for their silence systemically. They're promoted. In fact, the officers in the case of the killing of George Floyd had many complaints against them and also many promotions. So we have to ask ourselves how this works. It's really insufficient to have a thin analysis that says it's just a matter of bad cops. It's actually about systems that hold up the worst and the lowest common denominator actors, protecting them. If you don't get to the root causes, I just don't think that we're going to eradicate the kinds of problems and create the kind of social change that we want and to really live in a fair society.
Dr. Noble, in the
Yeah.
conversation around defunding police or reimagining law enforcement, is the concept to take it apart and then rebuild it in a more community manner, or to somehow rebuild law enforcement without those biases and structural stuff built in? What's the mechanism in the weeds that gets us from something that repeatedly doesn't work to something which we imagine accomplishes law enforcement without this baggage?
Well, I think first of all, the framework is around abolition and really understanding what abolitionists are calling for. The United States imprisons more of its citizens than any other industrialized nation in the world. It's a huge billion-dollar industry in this country. Many of the people who are incarcerated are people who have been, caught in the ensnared in drugs, people who needed mental health services, people for whom the education system failed them. There's a whole host of different kinds of people, not just violent offenders, who are imprisoned in this country. So defunding the carceral state, including the police and prisons, is really about reimagining the kinds of support that people in our communities need, whether it's homes, whether it's education, food, clothing, resources, social workers, mental health services. Those people should not be in prison. And of course, we know that when we have societies where people are highly educated, where they have the resources that they need to thrive, they are also less likely to commit violent crimes. So there's a whole, opportunity for us to reimagine how resources are deployed in our society equitably. When we talk about law enforcement, we're never really talking about enforcing, putting Wall Street traders who bankrupt our economy in prison. We're not talking about enforcing those kinds of laws. So even our idea of what criminality is, who's committing crimes? Is it a crime to deny protective equipment to doctors and nurses, but then see it rolled out in mass by the police in the streets who are confronting people who are exercising their democratic rights? I mean, all of these opportunities to talk about defund the police is really, I think, an opening for larger conversations about the distribution of our resources. And of course, I'm especially concerned with the tech industry because I find this industry has really been deeply implicated in social inequality in our country and in the world. They don't pay taxes. That's money that comes out of the public coffers. They use our public infrastructure, our post office, our roads. They take the cream of the crop of students to become their employees, and they don't pay their fair share back into the system. And of course, these are the systems that we need to support. So I see this as a real opportunity, this call.
Yes. So Sophia, can you bring me back in? I don't know if you can hear me. Anyway, I love this. And I worry about the experiment we call America more than anything, because I actually do believe in it. But I also feel like you're exactly this notion of it is systemic. It is a complex system thing. And if we don't actually look at the whole thing, everyone wants a silver bullet. Oh, yeah, we're just going to reboot the police and it'll be fine. But if we don't address all the rest, it's a joke and it's laughable.
We're dealing with really deeply ingrained beliefs and behavior that have to be, that some people even think are impossible to change. Yeah. I mean, go ahead.
Well, I remember visiting South Africa a few years ago, and it was with some family members who are African American and multicultural, and both white and black Afrikaners would get into bar fights with us at about 3 a.m, trying to convince us that South Africa, in this case, was an economic powerhouse because of the act of forgiveness and reparation, and because of the thing that Nelson Mandela did, that the entire country believed that they could they could actually face it, because they actually had to do the courts and face this in front of everybody, all the bad things, but they also had a reconciliation approach. And I don't know, who knows what the long-term play there is. But I wonder, Sophia, you make a case for reparations from the tech industry.
I do.
And Ta-Nehisi Coates did an amazing speech in Congress a year or so ago about this as well, who's just a stunning writer, journalist, and thinker as well. And I wonder, I've not heard anybody make that a news story, because they're all so beholden, I think, to the tech. Everyone is using Google Docs to have this conversation. Everyone is using Facebook to have this. Oh wait, don't screw up the market. And yet, it feels like there are plenty of ways we could do this and still have a positive growth for a lot of people. There's a big pie here. There's plenty to do. What do you see in terms of positive things that have happened in other countries? Like, I use South America as an example, but
well, I think that's a good example. I think that piece of it, the truth and reconciliation. In South Africa, the truth and reconciliation approach that Nelson Mandela took, I think it went really far. I mean, it doesn't solve all the problems, but at least it got people sitting down and talking about what had happened and who did it, and why they did it, and why it was wrong. We haven't had that conversation here yet. We still think that, there are still people here who think that, who want to believe that Barack Obama was not born in the United States and should not be president, even though the facts say otherwise.
Yeah, well, our president, actually, our current president,
but that's
famously got dissed by Obama during a press via the national press dinner, because Obama held up his birth certificate, and then suddenly that guy in the audience became our president. Then nobody cares about the truth.
Because white, and we haven't used this word, and I don't, because white supremacy is so deeply rooted in the fabric of this country, that people can dismiss things that they otherwise would not, because there is a blind spot. The white privilege creates a blind spot where they cannot see or feel the pain of other people.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I had a piece published this week. It's there's a quote up online. I'll send you the link if you're interested, to the magazine article, really calling to account that we need, we need a reconciliation. We need restoration. I think of models like, whether it's truth and reconciliation or restorative justice. There are different models by which we might interrogate, and of course lead us to what I think is the logical outcome, which is reparations. Because you see, you can't simply, these issues don't get resolved in the realm of beliefs. If the realm of beliefs were what mattered, then the world would be remade every time new people are born and new people die. But see, we're all born into and die from these systems that are in place. And so these are public policy investment conversations. And we cannot acknowledge the superpower, for example, the economic superpower that is the United States, without recognizing that is built upon the backs of free labor. You just cannot ignore that. There has to be a reckoning with that. In the state of California, I would say, here we have, I'm a UC professor, and the UC system is really suffering incredibly as our public university system, and yet California has the 7th largest GDP in the world, and part of that has to do with both agribusiness and Silicon Valley. So how is it that our public resources, be it public health, public media, public education, and of course we know that Black people, Latinos, poor people, Indigenous people are disproportionately locked out of participation and access to these systems, or these systems fail them? How is it that Silicon Valley doesn't pay its fair share to support California when we're one of the richest states that are richer than most countries? So I think we have to deal with these things. These are not going to get solved at the level of weeding out bad cops. This is a moment of reckoning for racial justice. And I think what we're seeing in the streets all over the world is a demand for racial justice.
Sophia, when you talk about tech industry reparations, is that a call for tech paying more taxes, or really
pay any
work?
taxes, I think is what her point is. But yeah, but also the public universities, UCLA, 4% is being paid by the tax dollars nowadays. And yeah. I used to think public universities were public. They were funded by our taxes.
No, 4%. Of the 4% of the UC budget comes from the state legislature now. And of course, where the money gets locked up, guess where? Incarceration and policing. So see, we're actually in direct competition, education versus incarceration. That is the truth of what's happening in the state of California. And we have to deal with that. Of course.
So if we could go down I just want to follow up on I'm interested in kind of your image or the mental model for where tech goes. So I get one issue might be they should pay taxes. Another issue might be that all of the algorithmic forms of bias that we see has to get dealt with either through a regulation or who they hire or whatever. But what is it, the program of what you'd like to see tech do? A lot of people in tech in this audience, what is that set of points?
Well, for sure, the taxes have to be addressed. Secondly, we've got to talk about the fundamental business model that's driving the majority of tech and predictive analytic kinds of projects coming out of tech corridors around the world, not just in California. And that is, these are about extracting information and data from the public, monetizing it, then using it to predict who's going to win and who's going to fail. And I think that we've got to fundamentally deal with the way that tech is over-determining, to Kathy O'Neill's point, who the winners will be. It's making them better and stronger winners. And it's also over-determining who will fail. And of course, this is the point of understanding an advertising-driven model of the internet that monetizes everything from your clicks and your likes to when you have your period. I mean, if you're a woman. So these are very real things that get monetized, that get circulated, that then intertwine with insurance systems, with mortgage approvals and denials, with banking systems, a whole host, again, of structures that determine the opportunities that we might hold or be denied in the future. So we have to actually look at the guts of these products that are coming out and decide whether we even want them to exist. And I think that's the kind of accountability. You know, we would never let three guys go into a strip mall, rent some space, cook up some chemicals, roll it out in Walgreens and CVS on the weekend. And then if people die or there's consequence, say, hey, well, it was just chemistry. But that's exactly what we do with software engineering and hardware engineers. We say, listen, we rolled it out. That Uber, it killed a bunch of people. You know, our bad. We learned something. I mean, you know, move fast and break things. This is ludicrous because the people upon whom are being most experimented and have the most to lose are poor people, Black people, brown people, Indigenous people, and it's unacceptable. And we have got to have a reckoning with that.
As we headed before the pandemic,
I feel like we should just end the show right there. That was it. I just
there are a number of quarters that are looking at the business models of tech and the kind of self-fulfilling runaway nature of algorithms. Right? We had Yael Eisenstadt on the show, who was a former CIA officer and ran national security for Vice President Biden. And of course, she was at Facebook running election security until she left because no one was listening. And you know, her concern was,
I think, that it was easier to negotiate with a Somali pirate than with Zuckerberg. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right. And her concern was, you know, we were beginning to have an understanding of the degree to which that system was hacked and creates vulnerability. And then, of course, heading into the pandemic, people were hugely relying on Facebook, and the constraint got relaxed a little bit. Now it's coming back again. So one of the questions is there, you know, what kind of alliance is there of a general sense that, look, these models have been extractive and they're not generative and they're not going to serve us. And so, you know, new stuff needs to emerge. That's been a theme that we keep revisiting here. I wanted to bring up a question about national leadership. I mean, it's particularly unfortunate that the national leadership we have now doesn't have an interest in kind of working the problem, but derives its energy from just continually dividing people. And to set that up, I actually wanted to show a clip here. In 1967, there were significant riots in Detroit, and in July that year, the country exploded, and Lyndon Johnson went on television to deal with it, not unlike Trump held a press conference last week. We know what happened in Trump's press conference. He had a press conference. He blew up a lot of tear gas. He went across the street, and then the military and D.C. tried to question whether the military was a good solution to this. So I want to just take us back to 1967, and here's a clip from Lyndon Johnson's address, and it'll be fun to go through and just tick down what he saw and how it is or isn't different from today, because I think how we respond and also how we respond through time is fascinating. Omid, let's just go ahead and run that.
My fellow Americans, we have endured a week such as no nation should live through, a time of violence and tragedy. For a few minutes tonight, I want to talk about that tragedy, and I want to talk about the deeper questions that it raises for us all. I'm tonight appointing a special advisory commission on civil disorders. Governor Otto Kerner of Illinois has agreed to serve as chairman. Mayor John Lindsay of New York will serve as vice chairman. The FBI will continue to exercise its full authority to investigate these riots in accordance with my standing instructions and continue to search for evidence of conspiracy. But even before the commission begins its work, and even before all the evidence is in, there are some things that we can tell about the outbreaks of this summer. First, let there be no mistake about it. The looting and arson and plunder and pillage which have occurred are not part of a civil rights protest. There is no American right to loot stores or to burn buildings, fire rifles from the rooftops. But when violence strikes, then those in public responsibility have an immediate and a very different job, not to analyze, but to end disorder through local, through police and state officials, and in extraordinary circumstances where local authorities have stated that they cannot maintain order with their own resources, then through federal authority that we have limited authority to use. It would compound the tragedy, however, if we should settle for order that's imposed by the muzzle of a gun. In America, we seek more than the uneasy calm of martial law. We seek peace that's based on one man's respect for another man. The only genuine long-range solution for what has happened lies in an attack mounted at every level upon the conditions that breed despair and breed violence. All of us, I think, know what those conditions are. Ignorance, discrimination, slums, poverty, disease, not enough jobs. And we should attack these conditions not because we are frightened by conflict, but because we are fired by conscience. We should attack them because there's simply no other way to achieve a decent and orderly society in America.
There was a lot going on in that clip.
Can we bring Lyndon Johnson back?
Hold on now.
He's gone. Yeah.
Now we're going to get into a big conversation.
By the
about
way,
Lyndon Johnson.
Peter does seem to keep exhuming bodies to bring his guests on the show. I was barely alive last week, so Lyndon Johnson and Marshall McLuhan seem to keep showing up. Actually, Sylvester, what's your reaction to that? To what he just said?
Well,
beyond the first comment.
He says all the right things, and they're easier said than done, as we see. The commission that he was talking about was the Kerner Commission. that in 1967, I guess, 68, concluded all the right things. I mean, that we were a nation divided, black and white, and it looked like we were on the road to doing something about it, these conditions. But every time, I mean, and here's what I think we are ultimately up against. From emancipation to today, every time African Americans have made progress, there has been a backlash. There was Reconstruction, and then there's Jim Crow. And then when school desegregation, 1954, the effort to desegregate schools, what happens? White families, you get the phenomenon of white flight. White families move so that their kids don't have to sit next to black kids and go to school with them. We get the election of the first African-American president of the United States. And then what happens? We get a huge backlash that results in the election of the man who's in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue right now. So knowing the right thing to do is one thing. Doing it is another.
I mean, Lyndon Johnson, to his credit, on the domestic front, was kind of motivated to do things, right? When after Kennedy was killed, and people said to him, Mr. President, trying to get a Voting Rights Act out before the election is going to use up a lot of political capital, and he famously said, "What the hell's being president for if not to do this?" Right? So he was inspiring there. It was interesting just to take that thing apart. He began by saying, "We got a big problem this week, but we need to look into the deeper causes." He also thought it was a conspiracy. Those riots happened in July. In August, the Senate held hearings led by Senator Kennedy. And the premise of the hearings was towards legislation that would get the conspirators, kind of like the then version of Antifa. It must have been someone on the left. And I know this because my great uncle was an expert witness. He was an expert in violence. And he said to Senator Kennedy, "I know you're looking to go find the conspirators, but that's not really the problem here." He, of course, made that really interesting point about very limited use of federal forces. And it's just prescient in the present context that he talked about. We can't get there through the muzzle of a gun or through martial law, which is, it just feels like history beating us over the head and giving us a reminder. So that was Lyndon Johnson.
Well, listen, I got to just add a thought here on this, because I know that there seems to be an impulse this week to compare Johnson to Trump. And I understand that impulse, because the nation is looking to kind of find a gentler moment of leadership. But, we don't want to forget that in 1968, in the events leading up to that speech, not only did what stands out for me is not only that this wasn't a Kerner Commission on civil rights, it was a Kerner Commission on civil disorder. And he leads this clip, he leads with saying that we're going to give the FBI the full authority to investigate the riots. Well, what we knew and later learned through the exposure, for example, of the counterintelligence program of the United States government, COINTELPRO, was that the FBI had been actively involved in undermining civil rights organizations and human rights organizations all over the country, whether that was the Puerto Rican independence movement, the American Indian movement, the Dr. King and the civil rights movement and civil rights organizers, the anti-war left. So, there was and the women's movement, quite frankly, women's equality movement, women's rights movement. So I think it's important to remember that we are also living in a moment where people are calling for these same kinds of civil rights, because we have witnessed for the last, for sure the last 4 years, but longer than that, we've been witnessing a rollback of civil rights. So I think that, we don't want to lose the thread of history here. Yeah. That this moment is actually in some ways similar to the 1960s. And I always find it interesting because my students, at UCLA and are always like, if I was alive in the 60s, I would have been in the streets. I would have done it this way or that way. And of course, this is their moment, because women's rights are being rolled back, civil rights, black lives are being extinguished on the national news. And what we see, in fact, are similar calls for law and order that aren't fully dissimilar to what Johnson called for. Now, certainly he had much more finesse and there was more humanity in it, but I don't think we want to paint Lyndon Johnson as the leader of the civil rights movement, because I think, he was not. So, this is the question is, again, he used a lot of words like authority and control, and put a lot of effort and emphasis on that. And of course, the code for that was that he was indeed investigating Black civil rights leaders, not unlike how this current moment is also putting our leaders under attack.
Absolutely.
Right. And he spoke in what, that was 67. And then the following year was when Dr. King gave his talk about riots are the language of the unheard. And he was less calling for riots and more saying, if we don't deal with this, it's just going to recur. Right. And so, I mean, you're right. Johnson was, and of course, he was then succeeded by, when he didn't run, by a campaign that was explicitly a Southern strategy and law and order. And we're kind of living with that same framing today.
But I think this point that Sylvester made too, which is this sort of 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, the blacklash that happens after any progress. I mentioned Ta-Nehisi Coates put out a book called We Were 8 Years in Power, but he wasn't talking about the Obama administration. He was talking about right after Civil War and Reconstruction. That was a quote from a congressman back in the 1800s. These echoes, Mark Twain says that history doesn't repeat, it rhymes. I think we need to beware, as Sophia said, of not trying to find too many exact corollaries to the past, because usually the history is written by the victor, the history is, painted in interesting pictures by the hagiographers that come back later. I think we need to deal with this right now. And we can learn maybe from history, but we might want to learn from history other than American history sometimes too. And the question is, how do we learn from the people who are out there right now? And how do we celebrate them? I was blown away by Killer Mike's talk in Atlanta, and by the Daily Show, and just some very powerful things. And those are the people who are speaking right now to things, and our leaders. And how do we amplify those? But Hoover is kind of just like our Attorney General, I guess, today. So
Correct.
There's a crazy thing happening. Yeah.
Well, I'm really glad you opened that, because I do think that, those in power get to narrate history, and they always narrate themselves as the winners. And of course, we do know that there are many untold stories. There was a beautiful and painful video that went viral that Ava DuVernay shared out a couple of days ago of a Black woman who was, just in so much pain, talking about and reminding us, you told us to take care of ourselves. We built Rosewood and you burned it down to the ground. We've had Black Wall Street. They burned it down to the ground. Tulsa, Oklahoma. There's so many places and spaces where Black people, we just try to live and thrive and live our best lives, and it's destroyed. And so, I want to amplify a film that is coming out, in fact, on Juneteenth, which is June 19th. It's allegedly the day that African Americans were freed from enslavement, but it was unfortunately rather small territory of space in which we were freed. But it is nonetheless, it is our 4th of July. It is our freedom celebration day, June 19th. And this filmmaker, her name is Ogi Ibuono, and she has this beautiful film called Invisible Portraits. And I just, am so stunned at what a beautiful Black Lives Matter kind of Black Lives film this is, that happens to coincide with being released at this moment. I mean, who could have ever predicted it? But it really narrates a different story from the voices of Black women about our vantage point into this country and into our histories and into the lives. And there in the film are mothers whose sons have been killed by police, grandmothers, children. It's a very poignant film. And so I really would just call everyone to please look for this film online.
I need to see it.
Yeah, I think it's going to be released on Vimeo first, and then it'll go to all the other streaming places. But, we need to counter narrate. And this, again, brings us back to, Sylvester, and the Black journalists and the Black storytellers. The counter narration is where the humanization happens. And that humanization is incredibly important. And maybe that will, in fact, inspire the kind of public policy and structural changes that we need in this world.
I think I remember Ruha Benjamin is maybe featured in that as well.
Is. Yes, she
the
is.
New Jim Code, right? Which is kind of a play on the new Jim Crow.
That's right.
That feels like an essential film to view. I would say we'll add that to our site and share it out with everybody. I will say the other thing that made a big impact on me, and I ended up meeting the daughter of Harry Belafonte who produced this. She produced a film a few years ago because she was worried that her children, Harry Belafonte's grandchildren, would never know about his social justice and civil rights work because he was a popular singer and he, would be song and dance and had a TV show. So she produced a movie called Sing Your Song. And it's available on Apple iTunes. And I went to a showing with her where I was with maybe a 90-year-old woman who had retired from the Kennedy School of Public Policy or something, who just swooned over 2 hours worth of Harry Belafonte. But I have to tell you, you find out that he ran a Kickstarter campaign of Pullman coach operators to bring a plane load of freedom fighters from the South to Kenya because they had just had independence, so they could learn about American freedom fighters, and the American freedom fighters could learn about a whole country that was free. And then he did another Kickstarter campaign to bring Obama's dad to America to buy plane tickets. And when you watch this documentary, you have no idea. He still fights to this day, though, I believe. So anyway, I think we should think about what's a film list so that people can and book list. Obviously, Sophia, your book has to be on the list.
Thank you.
I just want to always hold that up if we don't have a way to do that.
So kind.
I have a question. One of the operational issues we face right now is one thing social media done is we are in a more polarized world. So on the one hand, we see how truth and reconciliation, understanding, conversations can move things forward. On the other hand, we live in a world where the people who probably can most benefit from those conversations are exactly hearing a different echo chamber. So I guess one of the questions is, what are the kind of the self mechanisms or the mechanisms that can be promulgated, particularly in the time frame between now and the election, that can both drive understanding or perhaps detune some of this corrosive stuff that's going on, kind of practical things, because there's an awful lot of a movement out there that has been protesting and is calling for change, and to some extent it comes down to what are the right things for a movement to be doing in the coming months.
Well, I certainly think that voting, as hopeless as voting feels sometimes, especially I know for younger people who feel like that is not particularly the way, it is not just their voting, but also, people of conscience just putting themselves out there, run for the school board, run for the local elections, get involved. It doesn't have to be running for president as the only intervention or getting the president you want in office. I see, for example, in LA, we have an amazing organization called Stop LAPD Spying Coalition that is made up of people who are, people who live on the streets right now, people who are attuned to things like predictive policing, and they have organized so many different people to get LAPD to stop using things like facial recognition and predictive policing and really put the pressure on. Same in San Francisco. We see workers in Silicon Valley who are organizing and putting pressure. Facebook employees had a virtual walkout last week. Amazon workers, all kinds of people are becoming attuned and in the very place where they work, live, their neighborhoods, where they reside. So let's not turn all the power over to electoral politics, but let's not abandon that. And I was so heartened to see all of those African Americans and white Americans out in the streets in Georgia yesterday, in low-income neighborhoods, in Black neighborhoods, standing in the rain for 3 hours to vote because they understood what's at stake.
Yeah.
So, let's stand in the rain. Let's be in the streets. Let's talk to our employers. Let's write the letters. Let's,
do not be demoralized. Yeah.
Let's be heartened that in fact, there are many, many millions of people in this country who are done with the status quo as is.
To be a bit of a contrarian to Mickey, yesterday, Ta-Nehisi Coates was on the Ezra Klein show. Ezra asked him, well, how do you see the country right now? And his answer was, I can't believe I'm going to say this, but I see hope. I see progress right now. And I think it was some of the things that you were referring to.
Same.
I mean,
and I didn't hear him say that, but I feel that way too. I feel hopeful. And I think, 40 million people unemployed due to the coronavirus has given us an opportunity. I mean, not everybody has been comfortable in these weeks and these months of shutdown. And I think that we have to reckon. There will be a COVID 20. I was reading today, COVID 24, COVID 38. I mean, there will be more crises ahead of us. So now is really an important moment, especially as we enter the presidential election, and all the down ballot races are going to also be very important because these will be the people who will set the agenda for our future.
I have to say that the day that I read the headlines that people were protesting in South America and Berlin and Canada, and then I had to get my head, then I realized there was whatever their local version of oppression was. It occurred to me when the nation started and the revolution started, it was the shot heard around the world, right? The Enlightenment had been growing. There was this beginning realization we didn't actually report to the king or God. We had self-determination. And then we fought a revolution around it, and then it spread. And then the thing that gave me hope was in kind of all of this present moment of realizing, reform capitalism and technology has its extractive nature. It was something started here that spread. I mean, it was kind of like, in this case, it was this knee that got seen around the world but gave me hope that America was a place that started movements. I want to do a station break. It's 5:15. And of course, we tell everyone this is an hour show. So I want to point out we're looking at Quarantime. And if people have places to go, this is a good time to point out that we don't have to keep going forever. We do have one more clip I want to show.
Well, before we do that, Peter, I don't know if I'm breaking.
Yeah, go ahead. I want to set up for overtime, have a conversation now, and then see who can come back.
I'm having some internet problems.
Mickey's
Sylvester,
internet.
I know you can't stay for too long. Yeah.
I think Sophia summed it up quite well. That right now our biggest opportunity to deal with a lot of these issues that we face is to get out and vote. Vote like your life depends on it. Get everybody you know to vote. And as you say, many people think, I mean, I've talked with people who feel like voting is hopeless, that they voted for Hillary Clinton and she won by 3 million votes in the popular vote, and Donald Trump still was elected president. But it is still our best hope at the moment to at least be able to deal with some of these problems.
In the last show when we went back in history a bit with our friend Cordell Carter, we were quoting Lincoln's second inaugural, in which remember Lincoln's second inaugural happened just before the Civil War ended, but he wasn't gloating. He was basically saying, I think that all of the hundreds of thousands of deaths was kind of God's punishment for slavery, and his big concern was, until we got that behind us, it would continue. There was, I think, a thread between that and what Dr. King said when he talked about riots as the language of violence of not being heard, which is, if we don't get this behind us, it's just going to continue. And the most disappointing thing, kind of as an outsider looking in, or for people who have been through this for 400 years, is this is just an annoying thing to keep repeating, right? Because how do you make progress when you keep falling back to this predictable thing that that tears at the dream of what America could be. So
listen, I gotta just say, what can white people do? What can white Americans do right now to put themselves inside the heart of this conversation? Because the challenge, I think, for many African Americans, I don't speak for all of us, I'll speak for myself, I'll say, one of the challenges is that it's like it's our plight. It's it's sadness for what has happened to us or is happening to us. And white Americans disassociate themselves from the perpetration of this kind of culture, from the passivity of not speaking truth to power, not speaking back to the racist uncle at Thanksgiving, not getting their mom on point, not holding themselves accountable for when they clutch their own purses. So, these are the things to me that are actually the tragedy, is that this gets framed up as Black people's problem or struggle. This is white America's problem, white America's struggle. It's the reckoning has to actually happen there. And when those conversations come into the fore, it will be transformational, quite frankly, in my opinion.
And one of the issues, I have to survive in this country, I have to learn all kinds of things about white people, about white culture. White people don't have to know a damn thing about Black people to be successful in this country.
That's right. I have a T-shirt that I love to wear that says "Too tired to code switch," and I wear it sometimes. Just I wear it for my Black friends because they know what I mean. Because I'm a professor at UCLA, so I code switch for a living, and then I come home and I can be myself. So not everybody has to be multilingual and multicultural in this country in order to survive or get ahead. And even those of us who do are still victims of violence. Rich NBA players are still victims of violence and police brutality. Oprah can't even go into fancy stores without getting racially profiled. So class, in fact, is not your protection, and having fancy degrees is also not the pathway. I mean, we've got it. I think, Sylvester, you're absolutely right. I mean, these are not our problems. We are the victims of the problems made by others. And I think we need to put our focus on the problem making and the problem makers rather than the people who have to deal with the result of the problem.
There was Albert Einstein had this quote that what racism was a virus or a disease of white people, and he there's a whole bit about him lecturing. I think there's even a film being made on this, right? But there are just a bunch of things that remind us of this. Are you in the 1960s with the Freedom Riders and the degree to which people from the North went down to the South? That can either be seen as a hopeful example of the white community partnering to bring about change, but then again, Dr. King got disappointed afterwards that they were happy to go down south and yell at Alabama, but they weren't necessarily making changes up north. How do you help us understand that era and kind of the role of the North helping people in the South?
Well, I'll tell you that I'm from California. I was born and raised in Fresno, California, which is in the center of the state, huge agricultural community. And, when I was going to Fresno State as an undergrad, the largest campaign contributions to David Duke's campaign when he was running for governor or Senate in Louisiana, a known Klansman, head of the Klan. The majority of his campaign contributions came from California, and they came from middle class and wealthy people, doctors, lawyers, probably some people in Hollywood, who knows. So I think we got to dispense with this idea that to live in a so-called liberal state or to live in this so-called North somehow makes you better than, and that the real racists are in the South. The real racists are everywhere, and they have money and they have influence and they use it. And that's a fact. And they also hide their money. They hide it through dark money funneling processes and organizations that support, ultra right. And when I say I don't mean ultra right like the right versus the left. I mean like fascist and Nazi and white nationalist and white supremacist causes. So that takes money and that takes education, in fact, to prop up that kind of a system. And so it's a misnomer to think that it's just people in Alabama or Georgia who don't have an education who are holding that up. That's a lie.
My late mother.
We got to wipe that off. Yeah.
Sylvester, you were about to say something, which is
before I have to run. To that point, my late mother, my family is from the Mississippi Delta. I grew up in Chicago, but my mother said that when she left Mississippi, shortly after I was born, I was about 6 months old, and came to Chicago, she thought that she had indeed got to the promised land, only to find out, she said, that in some ways it was better living in the South because she knew exactly where she stood in the South. And being in a so-called liberal place, you never knew where you stood.
Yes, and I think Dr. King said a very similar thing. Like he knew where he stood with racists. I think this was in his Chicago, that same Chicago talk. I want to thank both of you. Mickey may or may not join us. He has internet fading in and out. And Sylvester, I am so glad that last time it was you who had the internet problems, but this was to have both of you on at the same time and listen, and then have the privilege of both going across generations and seeing it through your perspective is, this is as heavy duty a stream of learning as we've had on this show, and that's what makes it fascinating.
Thank you very much. I very much enjoyed it, and maybe we can do it again.
As we go out, I'm wondering, Sylvester, you and I both know Jeff Cowan, who in the 60s helped create a publication in the South, the Southern Courier. Do you think it makes sense to take a look at a little bit of ancient history in this movement?
Sure.
We're gonna go to a clip. If any of you are back when we're done, we can talk about it. But I know if you have to leave, that's great. Then we can wrap it up. But we've actually been trying to get Jeff put this bit on for 2 shows now. But we've had such intense conversations that it just didn't make sense to interrupt the conversation. Jeff is who was the dean was dean at Annenberg and runs the Communication Center for Leadership and Policy, and also happens to be a cousin of mine, and we both work with him. In the 60s, he was a student at Harvard. And then when the Freedom Riders went to go register people to vote in the South, when there were not voting rights, he and a bunch of his compatriots went down, and he's going to tell us a bit of that story. And then they created a newspaper called the Southern Courier, because it turns out that the press in the South, you can imagine, was not covering any form of the civil rights movement. In fact, the Southern press had a column called the Negro column that was about an inch wide and had, some social announcements. And so at some harm to themselves, a group created this Southern paper. So I want to play this because also, Sophia, this is a little bit about you better control a narrative and tell a story, and that's what they did. So I want to share with you, this is Jeff Cowan, who is both my cousin and our professional colleague over at USC. So let's just take a look at that, and then we'll come back.
In 1963, and it's kind of hard to realize that I was there then, I was a reporter for an intern with Time magazine. And part of that, and first time there was ever an intern, by the way, at Time magazine. And my job started in New York and then took me to Washington, D.C. And the trip to Washington, D.C. was a busload of people from Harlem going to the March on Washington. So I was at the March on Washington in Washington, D.C., covering it for Time magazine, but going on a bus with an African-American bus full of people coming from Harlem. And of course, at that time, we think of that as a peaceful protest, which it was. And most of what we're seeing today in the streets is a peaceful protest, with the need to explain themselves in some way. Of course, that is now most famous for the Martin Luther King "I Have a Dream" speech, but it was a huge gathering in Washington, D.C., which was respected and protected by the police. In the summer of 1964, much of my family, Peter, you were too young, but Peter, I should disclose, a member of the family too, went to Mississippi. That included my brother, my later sister-in-law, my brother Paul Cowan's sister-in-law, then around later Rabbi Cowan, and my mother, who started a group called Wednesdays in Mississippi of white and black women from the North and white and black women from the South. I went to a place called Batesville, Mississippi, which is in the Delta. And there had been murders in Mississippi. We all knew how dangerous it was. And we also were part of a nonviolent movement, but nonviolence didn't mean that you weren't mindful of violence. And one thing that's perhaps surprising to realize is that summer, there were, I lived in a home of an African-American family that actually had some resources. They had 7 tenant farmers on their own land. They were black, but they had other black families. And part of the summer I lived with a person who had a farm, but was living in what almost could have passed for an urban area in the dirt roads, but more people. In both of those homes, there were night riders who would come by and threaten our lives. And in the home with this couple who had 7 people living on their estate, and their daughter, who was a teacher, was living there too at the time, we had a rifle in our room. And we knew that, not that I had any idea how to use a rifle, but we need to be there for self-protection. So nonviolence didn't mean you were wimps. And the family that I lived with, which was in a more crowded area, very rural still, I lived with a man named Robert Miles. He later came to be quite well known. He and his family had been the people who fought for voting rights. We still didn't have Voting Rights Act in Panola County. And they were so despised by whites that people would drive by and firebomb their house or burn crosses to their home. And their neighbors spent the night, every night, there was somebody on the roof of that house, usually 2 people, with rifles to protect the house. So nonviolence didn't mean you weren't prepared to be protecting yourself, because if you didn't, the fact was you would be at least firebombed and possibly killed.
Take us through, you were down there and you were doing civil rights work, and then you became a publisher because there was no voice.
So maybe I should tell you what I was doing in Freedom Summer in Mississippi. We were doing a couple of things. One, we were registering voters, and in this particular county, you could register voters. Most of the state, you couldn't. There were also freedom schools, you probably know that, which were educational opportunities for young African Americans. But also, we were not just registering voters, but creating a parallel political system in which, since for most of the state, blacks couldn't vote in 1964, we held county conventions of African Americans who would go there in a parallel system to try to then elect people who went to the state convention, where I was there with my brother and Harold Ickes, whose name you probably know, and others who are well known today. And then we went from that state convention to the national convention. And most famously at the national convention, one of the people who came, who was part of our delegation, Fannie Lou Hamer, who gave powerful testimony in front of the Credentials Committee that year because blacks couldn't vote. And the argument that was made was, how could you exclude a delegation that had blacks in it and only seat a delegation that was exclusively composed of whites? So that's what we were doing as civil rights workers. 2 of my colleagues I was at Harvard at the time, 2 of my colleagues from Harvard had the idea of starting a newspaper, a Southern newspaper, civil rights newspaper. And we did start it, and it was called the Southern Courier, and I was a part of that group. And our first summer of 1965, I was the Montgomery bureau chief. It sounds a little elevated. Me and one other person were Montgomery, but anyway. And we had a lot of terrific young African American journalists who were part of our group. But I was in Montgomery that summer. It was the era of George Wallace. The newspaper was printed in Atlanta, and the headquarters of the newspaper was in Atlanta. Why? Because there was so much of a danger that the printing plant would be bombed if we printed in the state of Alabama.
And in reading about it, it's probably important to point out what the disparity was. In the local press, African Americans were covered in the Negro column, which I gather was a column inch wide and didn't say much. And then when this came out, it created a lot of ire because you were giving voice to a movement. And that must have just been incredibly anger producing among people who did not expect the press to pop up in their midst.
Well, of course, you live with heroes. And I was very lucky that summer that I went down. I was at Yale Law School. This was the year after I graduated from Harvard. So Yale Law School. And I went down with two students from Yale who had special British scholarships. And we drove down together, and they were friends with a man named Clifford and Virginia Durr, a couple named Clifford and Virginia Durr. And we wound up living with Clifford and Virginia Durr, who were whites who lived in Montgomery. And Virginia Durr was Hugo Black's sister-in-law. They were total outcasts because Clifford Durr, who was a great lawyer and been a member of the Federal Communications Commission, and in that capacity, by the way, deserves a lot of the credit for creating public radio, now public television too. But Cliff Durr went back down to Alabama, had a law practice, and there was a woman who was their seamstress who sat down at a part of the bus where she wasn't supposed to, at the front of the bus. There was nobody to represent her. Cliff Durr represented Rosa Parks and lost all clientele. And those were the people I lived with. So there were people who were heroes at that time, and they were so inspiring that I think they had more impact on how you saw the world than the fact that they were shunned by most of polite Montgomery society, but not everyone. And there were people that we knew who were their friends then, who to this day remain people who I admire enormously.
This is great. We could go on, but you've kind of reminded us the incredible power that people can have with media and how change comes along because people who did not expect to be change makers and heroes show up.
Can I just tell you one other thing about what we did that summer?
Yeah.
So we realized the importance of visual images, which are a huge part of the story today, visual images. And one of the things we decided to do and publish in the paper was have a page every day that was exclusively of pictures. And there was a man named Jim Pepler, he was probably 19, 20 years old at the time, who came down as a photographer. Jim Pepler ultimately had maybe the biggest library of pictures of the South during that time. The cover of one of Taylor Branch's books, King, is a picture that Taylor Branch took, that Jim Pepler took that summer as a photographer for the Southern Courier. So the role of photography, still photography then, motion photography today, as a way of documenting the world that we live in, is enormously powerful phenomenon. The audio work that you're doing is important. The video work was and remains important too.
We'll cover more of this on the show today as we move through the early 1990s and Rodney King and this completely live moment. Jeff, thanks, and this to be continued.
My pleasure. Thanks, Peter.
All right, so we finally found a moment to get Jeff on. That does speak to the kind of the power of putting press in there. Sophia, any final thoughts?
Well, I really appreciate Jeff. Frog in my throat. Sorry. I really appreciate Jeff's comments there about he was just living with extraordinary people and almost, the everyday banal nature of being around people who notice there's something they could make a difference with and they do it. And then you look back in retrospect and you realize it was somebody who was a lawyer for Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks might be the person sitting next to us at work, the coworker who we have witnessed being abused, and we just stand up and say, I see what you're going through, and it's not right, and I'm going to be here with you through this journey. I really believe that, the change that we so desperately want, it doesn't come from the Messiah on high. It doesn't come from the special person. People aren't born great. We become great through every single action that we take. That's the right thing to do. And then we look back and, some of those things jump out for us and they were important and we remember them. And I guess this would be the thing to me that would be such a great note to end on, which is just to think, who knows that maybe our conversation, the three of us and anybody listening and the things that they do just while this is running in the background of their lives might be the next important thing that happens. But it's really hundreds of thousands and millions of little things that make the change. And we should never, ever underestimate our power.
Hallelujah.
That was inspiring. Thank you. What a great way to end.
I like it. And I do think if you're white and looking at this, just imagine how wrong you probably are, because I'm pretty sure that your assumptions are shaped by your context. And maybe just listen and then help, because we need everybody on deck for this. And I think that's one of the most important things that I think Sophia and Sylvester both shared with us today.
And, while we've spent time disparaging these tools of social media, these are also the most powerful tools in history to self-organize and for small groups to have big impact and for change to connect up globally, right? So that is, I think what you've given us is a great charge and also an important thing to self-reflect and look inward, because change clearly starts with wherever we're all at.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Sophia.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Thank you so much. It's now 5:40 Pacific Quarantine. Mickey, we will be back Friday, and we're going to be cruising into several shows that are really focused on how the economy comes back, work that we do in our cities, a lot of the creative work that needs to be done as we head into this period of change and economic development.
Yeah, I don't want to say anything else. I thought that was just wonderful. I think we all have to just learn how to listen, and let someone else take the lead, particularly those people that have been victimized for so long and fighting 4 pandemics, not just one. And they're all sort of invisible, but they're very visible right now. So listen, try to learn. And we should all watch all the movies and books, read the books that we've heard, and just try to open our minds.
Thank you to Omid and Mohib, who are our back-end technical side, and also to Jocelyn, who is new to our team. And we will be back, and this continues. I guess next week will be our 12th week. Thanks, everybody. Have a great Wednesday.
Thanks, everyone.
Let's get close, but not so close. Quarantine. You can share from a distance. Quarantine. We want to see each other. We'll have to stay in your quarantine space while we talk.